So a warm Columbia welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks especially to SIPA, the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, and to SEAS, the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, for hosting this event and for making it possible. This is one of the first collaborative events between SIPA and SEAS, International and Public Affairs and Engineering and Applied Sciences, but I hope it is certainly not the last. One of the jobs of provost of the university, which is actually what I am. I should have introduced myself. I'm John Coatsworth, the provost. One of the jobs of the provost is to march around the university taking credit for inter-school collaborations that produce really interesting results. So I'm pleased to be here to do exactly that. But the credit really should be lodged in the hands of the two deans of these schools and the collaborative spirit of their faculty and students. SIPA and the engineering school and their students share a focus on coming up with innovative solutions to the world's most pressing problems through a deep understanding of technology and public policy. I think this is a frame for a series of collaborations which the two schools will engage in over time, which I think will be enormously productive for Columbia and for the world. I want to especially welcome Craig Mundie to Columbia. We've been waiting for him to come for a long time. We've been eagerly expecting his visit. It's wonderful to have him with us. As you know, Craig is a visionary expert in the intersecting fields of technology and public policy. The issues he focuses on are of great interest and increasing importance to Columbia, as well as to the rest of the world. And these include things like cybersecurity. Where are the problems coming from? What can be done to address them, both as a technical matter and as a matter of public policy? Cybersecurity is going to become an issue of even greater importance in the future than it is now. Another issue that he's been focusing on is online education and its impact on higher education as well as education more generally. I can tell you there's nothing on which the Provost's office has spent more time in the last year or two than trying to figure out what a MOOC is and what to do about it. Online education, both as a pedagogical tool within the institution and as an opportunity to bring educational resources to people around the globe, is an issue of fundamental importance to universities in the United States and elsewhere. He's also focused on the nature of innovation and the future of technology itself. How do we get innovative institutions that promote new developments in technology? How do we foster creativity in engineering and in public policy? And applying technological tools to the management of cities and their problems, to pluralization and to online movements around democratic governance. There are all kinds of ways that these technologies can make the governance of any unit, but particularly cities, especially sensitive to public opinion and to concerns of the public, calling attention to issues and even resolving many of them. Green cities is an example of this. How does one use technology to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to make cities more livable, and to make them more, if you will, sustainable? So it's a particular pleasure to welcome Craig here today. Collaborative, engineering-based approaches are driving sea changes in incredibly diverse fields. Here at Columbia, we have many ongoing initiatives that blend engineering with other disciplines, including the Brown Institute for Media Innovation, the Mind, Brain, and Behavior Institute, the Tau Center for Digital Journalism, our new SEAS-based Institute for IDSE, Institute for Data, Science, and Engineering, whose director and co-director are here. So Columbia's new Data Sciences Initiative and our distinctive interdisciplinary collaborations. This event promises to be a fortuitous meeting of minds, the first, I hope, of many. Again, thank you all for joining us on this special occasion, and I'm pleased to welcome Dean Merritt Janow, who will introduce our great speaker.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, John. Well, I think we're going to have here a true fireside chat, so may I invite Craig Mundie to join me here. And I think we're going to use the next 30 minutes or so for really just a general discussion, if I may, a variety of questions. I might start to get us going and then open it up to all of you. As you know, Craig Mundie has really played a crucial role at Microsoft as its key strategist, former head of Microsoft Research, head of the chief strategy officer responsible for Microsoft's global strategies around the world, and has been a senior strategist and liaison with the U.S. government and with foreign governments, including China, Russia, and India, seem to be called out in your vita particularly. So I can see you've spent time both in developed economies and important emerging markets. Craig has served on many governmental advisory bodies, including President Obama's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, which I think every critical S&T question comes before this advisory committee expecting you to have wisdom and help solve the issues as a nation. Early in his career, he built many startups in supercomputing, consumer electronics, education, healthcare, and robotics. So I think with this incredible background, it's a license to ask you almost anything. But let me start with a few questions around cybersecurity. You know, in thinking about cybersecurity, the bad actors are obviously numerous. We have thugs, we have criminals, we have state-sponsored disruptions for commercial espionage, and then perhaps things that are akin to warfare. So can you share with us how you think about the threats that companies, governments, and individuals face and how they should be dealt with?
Well, as your question mentioned, that I think one of the biggest challenges we have in the policy space these days, and even in sort of the public communications about cyber things, is that people tend to conflate all these different things. So in my mind now, I have a relatively simplified taxonomy. You mentioned several of them. You know, it goes something like this, that there's malicious mischief, there's crime, there's espionage or surveillance type activities, there's warfare, and there's terrorism. So to some extent, you know, that's the full spectrum of threats. And you could say it's now evolved in cyberspace to be equivalent to the full threat of threats, the full scale of threats that we have in the physical world. The other thing that's important, though, is to recognize that in this cyberspace environment, perhaps more than in the others, there's a different types of actors in each of these boxes or each of these areas. So in a simple sense, you can think of the actors as there's amateurs, pros, and governments. And so right out of the chute, you've got 15 different things, and every one of them is slightly different. So in terms of what do you do about them, the answer is you have to think carefully about each of these different cases to decide what your course of action is. And of course, there's actually more complexity than even that implies. Take the espionage case. You know, one of the big areas that the U.S. government's focused on right now is this special thing we call economic espionage, which is where a government uses its national means to steal, you know, commercially valuable assets from another country's businesses for the express purpose of giving them to their own businesses. And a number of governments have done this, but it appears that either there's a criminal problem at huge scale or a policy problem at huge scale in China, because the amount of economic espionage that's being perpetuated there is very high. And so that becomes a real issue. Unfortunately, you know, when you just talk about espionage, you include, well, there's military espionage and there's, you know, all these other forms of espionage, and some of them are going to go on. They've gone on for hundreds or thousands of years. And those aren't really so much of a problem as perhaps economic espionage is when it's practiced asymmetrically. So I just offer that as an example of having to look inside each one of these boxes asking who is the actor you care about, and then what would you do about them. Crime, of course, exists at a petty scale, probably not worth doing that much about. It exists at an organized level, and that's the equivalent of organized crime. But now organized crime operates with impunity in cyberspace at a macro level, and therefore our conventional legal systems and our enforcement mechanisms, while they're all there in paper, have never really been adapted to the speed and scale at which these things happen in cyberspace. So, I think we have a complex problem. What we ultimately need to do is to have lawmakers and policy people look at each one of these things in a specific way and decide what the right course of action is.
Well, let's take the example you've raised perhaps of economic espionage. There are things that companies can and do both defensively and perhaps even offensively. And there are things that governments can do about economic espionage if it's state-sponsored. So could you tell us a little bit more how you think about company actions, whether it's by hardening your own systems or even being proactive against would-be intruders?
Well, when I think of economic espionage, I think of that exclusively as sort of the state being the actor. Mm-hmm. You have industrial espionage. Yeah. You could say, which is where you have a business who may seek to steal things from another business, and that could be either within one country or between countries. The real problem right now is that if a nation state chooses to use their full array of capabilities against even a sophisticated business, the business almost doesn't stand a chance. And so part of the problem we've got is that people are still thinking that if they use conventional defensive techniques to improve the perimeter security of their network, that they're going to be okay. That may be sufficient against malicious mischief or petty criminals, but it's questionable against sophisticated organizations, and it's probably hopeless as a defense strategy against a government. The reason is governments don't confine themselves to the network means of attack. They'll come in and bribe your system administrator. They'll come in and threaten to do evil things to his family or whatever it might be. And so people become a key component of compromise. That's always been true. But we now start to see those kind of national techniques being applied in these economic espionage cases. And therefore, even if your CIO tells you that, he's happily, got the perimeter secured, you really can't believe that. I think it's even worse than that, though, because the era of thinking that you can be secure by having perimeter security is sort of the medieval model of cybersecurity, where you had a big castle and the walls were thick and tall and a nice moat, and you thought everybody that I cared about was inside. But today, it's almost guaranteed to be the case that, that the Trojan horse is already inside the castle and the cruise missile has already been invented. And, if you're still playing sort of classical defense, it's a very, very tough situation. Mm-hmm. So I think whether you're a business or a government now, you really need to start to think, wow, there's really sophisticated actors here. And if I have anything I really care about, I'm going to have to take some additional steps to try to protect these things. And I think what's going to be required is almost, compartmentalization, of the key assets that are valuable from sort of economic terms. And then the other half is people are going to have to think about the continuity of operations question in a very fundamentally different way and start to think about how they can determine what facilities are essential for their enterprise to continue to operate and think about how you're going to, either build those to be redundantly, redundant in a better way or segregated in some way. But the idea that we're just going to have one big happy network in an enterprise, use conventional means of access control and think that you're going to be okay against a nation state attack or frankly even a terrorist attack. One of the big challenges is that we now see that conventional deterrents don't really work because the network is international in its basic architecture. And so you can't really rely on local, even national law enforcement or deterrent mechanisms to keep these actors from doing bad things. That's why the fifth category, the terrorist bucket, is now a real problem because you have undeterrable players with real sophistication who recognize that companies and countries are increasingly vulnerable to these kind of attacks. And companies are really going to have to start to think differently about that.
And do you think there's more that should be done bilaterally between governments or multilaterally amongst governments to engage around these issues? Or is that happening at the speed and in the nature that you think is the best that can be expected? Are there doctrines here that we should be thinking about? We used to have a no first use and nuclear. I mean, we should be thinking about these as law enforcement treaties. How do you see the international protocols around this evolving?
Well, I think that we need to do more work in that space. And I would tell you it's largely, almost completely absent so far. So you now have a world that is completely hooked on all of these capabilities. And it's like running water and electricity. You can't go backwards. The society has adapted to this model of operation, and there is no path back. Mm-hmm. But the thing that people don't fully appreciate is the speed and scale at which devastation, if you will, can be wrought using these cyber methods is unlike anything that we've really known before. In a sense, other than in apocalyptic nuclear scenarios, even nuclear and biological threats don't propagate at the same rates and at the same scale of impact that these cyber things can. So society literally has never really known anything that could be as bad as fast as cyber could. And yet I think people are only awakening to that problem now. And the policy people have largely, they don't come from this space. They don't have the years, I'll say, that built up, in the nuclear and biological domains. And so, suddenly we've landed here. In the past, policy people, I'll just take nuclear since you raised it, could still say, okay, the country's here, those people over there have nukes and we worry about them. So who worries about them? Well, the military worries about them, both in terms of countermeasures and defensive capabilities. The thing that's unique about the cyber problem is that it goes around the classical model of defense, that it's sort of direct from the bad guy to the end user at scale. And as a result, it's not only happened faster, but the effects are more pervasive in the society than any of these other things were. And therefore, we don't have a way to tell the society, well, we're worried about that, so just don't use it anymore. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I think we do have a problem. As to what to do about it bilaterally or multilaterally, I think we need more activity than we have today. Certainly, in business, you sometimes hear the terms co-opetition or sometimes frenemies, right? And I think governments are really going to have to come to grips now with the fact that they're going to have some co-opetition, which means they compete in certain areas like military espionage, but they better help each other, in other areas like, for example, the deterrence of terrorism or cyber terrorism. There you have a common enemy, and you better figure out how you're going to respond to them. But those, because there's no good taxonomy, I don't find that the policy people have segregated these into buckets that said, well, I may be unhappy with this economic espionage problem, but boy, we both have a problem with this terrorist group. What do we want to do about it? And I think until we get that kind of segmentation, the policy discussions either don't happen or they immediately degenerate into, he said, she said kind of arguments about one of these things or the other. And I think we've got to get past that as fast as we can.
Thank you. Let me shift gears to privacy, because we're going to try and cover a bit of landscape before we open this up. We all recognize that there are different attitudes about privacy in different parts of the world, and the regimes that are created around it. And I know that you have argued that it's no longer possible to control the collection and retention of data, and that we now have to think about a policy framework that's more focused around use. And I think, and rules that are more defined in metadata. Can you share with us your thinking about the regulatory regime around use and the sanctions and incentives that you think are needed to embed, to shift to a use-based model?
Well, today, we live, I'll say, in the countries that care about privacy, which is primarily Europe and the U.S. have been the most invested in that for 30 or 40 years. We live in a regime that started with the idea that the public interacts with either a government or a business, and they exchange some data in return for a benefit. So, for example, in the banking world, you give them some information, they give you a credit card. When you use the credit card, you know that they get to track what your purchases were, and they learn something from that. As long as you don't feel abused by what they did with that information, you were happy to exchange it, for the use of the credit card, convenience or actually credit access. But now what's happening, in my view, is that the amount of data that is being produced as a byproduct of everything is so large that there's no longer any correspondence between the collection of a particular data type, its potential ability to be used, for a purpose you might not like. You didn't participate in any conscious way in saying, hey, I gave you that data in exchange for anything. You may have just been living your life every day, and the data is just being, accumulated. And the problem is the technology has now gotten to the point where we can aggregate these disparate, essentially independently collected pieces of data in ways that are very powerful in either economic uses or potentially other uses. And you see this manifest in all the questions about, for example, intelligence and surveillance and other things that where governments have realized, that the best, arguably maybe even the only effective way to track, terrorist activities or other things is by, in fact, looking for anomalies in the data patterns, that define everybody's use. And of course, that then leads to the questions, that have been brought to the fore by the Snowden disclosures, where people who don't really understand this process, don't know whether they should be worried or not about that, and and the fact that while there's certain rules for domestic and they're different than international, and that the governments haven't really reconciled these things, just creates a lot of more questions than it provides ready answers. And so because of that, I think that we have to change the model away from the one that says, what we're worried about was knowing when data got collected and controlling how long it might be retained, which was sort of a blunt instrument that has been used to try to think that they could prevent bad things from happening. But in a world where you need the data, whether it's your genome or your proteome or just your life history, if you need the data to function in the society, then you can't throw it away as a prophylactic measure to just prevent some future bad thing from happening. And that's the dilemma. And so I think that we need to now use the technology that creates the problem to give you some weapons to address the problem. Computers are really good at bookkeeping, and what you need to do is have an architecture for keeping the books on the usage that is permitted and not permitted. It turns out the magical thought that and I think enables people to go down this path is to realize that in the digital domain, there is no use without a program. People don't use the data directly. Their mind isn't coupled to some set of bits someplace. It's a piece of software that actually is seeing the bits and doing the interpretation that produces the use from which, you either get value or problems. And so in a sense, what you want to do, I think, is create a regulatory scheme that requires that all data is annotated at the point of its origin, so you know its provenance, that all transactions on data have a mandatory auditing requirement. Storage is no longer a problem. I mean, storage is, for all intents and purposes, free relative to these problems today. We now have machines that are big enough to kind of keep score on all these things. And it then allows you to even change your mind. And this is actually also important because I contend that most things that people will worry about haven't been invented yet. I mean, if you think of the Facebook phenomena and people's anxiety about Facebook, well, it wasn't that many years ago, there was no Facebook, all right? So you couldn't have known that you should have worried about that until there was one. And it's only when you saw it emerge at scale that you could realize, well, maybe there's some things we don't like about that. Then you have to decide, is it just a person who didn't like it, an institution didn't like it, or a whole society that didn't like it? And based on which level it is, then you have to decide who gets to set the policy on use. And then the most counterintuitive example, I contend, will be when you discover that in the future digital world, the society will ultimately require an override to mandate certain uses of data that an individual may not like. It's a bit like the vaccine question, I mean, where some people say, well, I'm not sure I want my kids vaccinated. And the society says, no vaccination, no school, all right? And because the threat is too high to everybody else. So you do give up some personal freedoms, in this case. And I think we're going to find out that, for example, in health, with respect to certain data, when the future of healthcare is all driven by data, letting some subset of the population say you can't see my data is basically taking the population statistics and distorting them. And, so the society may come in and say, well, sorry about that, but there's certain things for certain uses that we're going to require that data to exist for. And I think that all of this gets so complicated that unless you use the machine to control the machine, you don't have a chance. But I think there is an architectural basis to do that. The one thing that you need from the regulators then is laws with real teeth in them that say everybody has to use this mechanism. Because otherwise, you have a sort of a rogue environment that would run around outside it, and that's what you're trying to avoid.
Let me ask you just one question about big data. We have a lot of experts in the room around that, but I'm wondering if you could share a few perspectives on what is going to drive the usefulness of big data. Will it be the ability to filter and screen, or algorithms, or the nature of the data itself? What elements are truly valuable?
Well, I don't think the value comes from any one particular piece of data.
No.
I think what we're finding is that you just want to keep all the data, because the more you have, the more creative people get in terms of finding out what it's good for. And so, happily, the technology is moving us in a direction where, the economics of remembering everything are good. In a sense, the search engines of the world today at least say anything that represents itself as data on a web page is not only persisted forever, but it's perfectly recallable. Neither of these properties have existed in the past. I mean, we didn't remember everything, and even where it was stored, you couldn't find it later. So, in a sense, your memory faded away. Today, that world is gone. Now, if it exists, you should assume it persists and it can always be found. So then if that's the case, you say, well, then what's the next thing that's valuable? I think that the most important family of technologies in this is going to be machine learning. Most people with big data today are still doing what I call, business intelligence or some type of classical analytics. They use visualization techniques, statistical, classic statistical processes. And that's all valuable in it as far as it goes. But I think the qualitative change comes from this very high-scale machine learning capability. That's an area we've invested in at Microsoft for a long time. We use it in many ways in the company. And I think that it is the technology that will really turn out to make the biggest difference in terms of unexpected value that gets created from the data exhaust of life and work.
Thank you. Let me end my questions with just a couple around education and education policy. As you think about the Microsoft global ecosystem, what are the skills or characteristics that you correlate with effective and meaningful innovation? And, what are the differences, if you will, by region that drive the effectiveness of innovation? Because ultimately, this comes back to education and educational emphasis and skill sets. So do you have any observations about that you think it's important for educational environments to think about?
Well, I think the classical definitions of innovation, are what happens when you take invention and add a dose of implementation. An innovation is something that actually has market value, market being broadly defined. And so, but if you think of that as an equation, then you kind of can describe, the different things that you have to have an innovation environment, and to some extent what the classes, at least, of skill sets are that are required. So first, you have to have inventions. And, at Microsoft, the decision Bill Gates made some 20-odd years ago was that he was unwilling to bet the long-term future of the company on the idea that the inventions on which future innovations would be built could always be acquired from outside the company. And these days, that turns out to be a fairly rare decision. Most companies have actually exploited what I think is the failings of government to meet its basic requirements to fund basic science, largely in the university. That has made the universities very hungry for alternative sponsorship, which business, being economically rational, has been very happy to step in and provide. The difference is they provide it with strings attached, as opposed to the government that largely said, hey, I just support basic science. And that has, I think, foreshortened the time horizon over which the basic science is getting done. And companies are giving up their ability to do it themselves. It's fine to be able to take it out of the university, but at least we believe that you have to both contribute and add to that pool, but you have to control, at least in part, your own destiny from the invention point of view. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have a bunch of inventions, that you can then add, effort to make into an innovation, which you can then take to market, then, that your long-term health may be questionable. So the second thing you have to then have are people who are willing to take risks, because it turns out the people who do the basic science are not particularly risk tolerant, all right, because their time horizons are long and the success measures are not, sort of black and white monetary measures. The people who take the invention and are going to add something to it in order to make it into a business or a product have got to be willing to take risks. And, my belief is that risk tolerance is sort of a genetic trait, and not very many people really have the gene. And as a result, the trickiest part is how to figure out how you ensure yourself steady access to people who are willing to take those risks to convert an invention or an idea into an innovation. Then the third thing I think is oftentimes missed is what you might call capital M marketing. The ability for people to figure out how these things actually get placed into the marketplace. And so to ultimately have an innovation economy at whatever scale you want, I think you have to be sure that all these things are there. So a company like Microsoft can look at it and say, okay, I know how I'm going to control my parts, but there needs to be you could say a shadow or mirror part of every one of those things at some higher scale that exists in the environment itself. And that's where the policymaker has to try to ensure, or the educator, that you're producing people who fit each of those buckets. Are you producing people who can do the basic science? Are you producing people who can do the innovation part? And are you producing people who know how to make markets as opposed to deliver things into established markets? And I contend that the people who are good at each of those three things are not, they are not, in the norm. They're not very many of them.
Yes.
And in particular, the academic programs don't really try to select out or teach people who even think that they might be interested in that end of the problem. They really tend to be, teaching for what I call the steady state. I think this is a problem at a macro level because, history would show now, I think quite convincingly, that almost all new employment are created by small to medium-sized companies. And so those places inherently carry more risk, if they're going to continue to invest, because they just have less, critical mass. And yet you could say that the big company mindset tends to permeate the way the university thinks about who their target audience is, even though those companies won't create the bulk of the future jobs. So I think there's some mismatches all along the way.
Well, thank you. Before we leave today, we'll have to come back to online. We can't let you leave without that. But I do want to have, since we have a lot of people here, a chance for others to ask questions. So may I invite anyone who would like. We do have a mic, Kathy, would you like to get us started?
Otherwise, people on the camera can't hear.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not sure if is this on?
Yep.
Very good.
Okay. You said a lot about the threat to businesses, and I'm curious what advice you would give to individuals about the trade-off between the benefit of data versus the risk to their privacy. So, the benefit through of search, but you're giving up your data to advertisers, or the use of maps, which gives you the benefit, but you're giving up your location. And then even to the point of the intelligence having access to huge amounts of our data, but the trade-off, which you pointed out, is they see anomalies and can find threats. So I wonder what you would have to say about the trade-offs between those things.
In part, the reason I keep advocating why we have to shift to a usage-based way of doing things is perfectly illustrated in your question. Because the problem is, in my mind, if you say, hey, I want to use an app, and quote, it just collects your location, how do I know whether I should worry or not? Because what are you going to do with my location? If you told me, hey, I'm an app and I collect your location, and this is what I'm going to do with it. Or if I told you, any new use I have for your location, I will inform you of. All right? Then if I got that promise from somebody and I could then make a decision, yep, like that, nope, don't like that, I wouldn't care that you took my location. Because what I got in return was a promise that anytime you used it for a new thing, you would tell me. I think the problem for the public today is that we scare them into thinking that, well, there might be a bad future use of whatever it is that I'm collecting. But I can't be specific about it. And oh, by the way, once you've decided, it's over. All right? You don't have any more choice. That's why I think the regulators and the public are tied up in knots over this, because the regulators keep saying, well, I guess we better give you the choice of requiring them to destroy the data. And then I give you the example of the genomics. You say, well, yeah, but I do want to get medical care. Oh, well, that's a really tough choice then. All right? And so I think the problem comes because we aren't giving people a statement of what the use of the data is. And therefore, they're led to try to sort of opt out of everything to prevent a future use that they might not like. I think that's just bad from an economy and a psychology point of view. And it's also pretty clear that the problem's only going to get worse, because there isn't going to be any part of your life or work that you'll be able to do without having a data exhaust as a byproduct. And therefore, we're going to have to change. And I'm very convinced. Not everybody is convinced, but I'm convinced.
Hi. Let's see, I'm a graduate of SIPA and have had a career in government oversight. There was recently an article in the New York Times that talked about global warming and increasing food shortages. And it was talking about a decrease, projecting about 2% decrease in food per decade. And the article didn't seem to deal with the likelihood that increased global warming will also flood a lot of the deltas that produce the food in the world. It also talked about a sort of projected rate of increase of population where normally you'd get 500 million more people a decade. That suggests that if nothing drastic is done, you will have huge numbers of people dying prematurely if there isn't very, very solid progress on the global warming front. Do you feel that President Obama has a sufficient policy to either on the national or international level to handle this problem?
Well, I'll give you two answers. I mean, clearly the president, from what exposure I've had, is aware of and focused on this question. And there've been recent policy actions. Part of the counsel that I think he's been getting from the science advisors has been that, you can't just sit around and hope that there's a solution. You actually have to, take two different kinds of steps. One is you better think about mitigation. If bad things happen, are you prepared, to deal with them? In this town, I mean, it's sort of looking after Hurricane Sandy and saying, okay, well, post Sandy, what did you learn? And, what mitigations would you put in place, for the future? The flip side is a more personal view, which is, I would argue that almost all of those forecasts are being made under the assumption of constant technology. And being a technologist and an engineer by training, my view is that society, the people who are the cavalry that like ride in on the white horses over the hill and bail you out as a society, they're always the engineers and scientists. All right? It's always been true. And a lot of the forecasts of these sort of apocalyptic global warming scenarios that says, unless you can stop the warming of the means that we currently have, everything is going to be a bad outcome, kind of denies the idea that people will rise up to the engineering challenge. I've got friends, who sit around and think about inventing things. One of the things they have invented is a way to say, look, if we really get in deep trouble, how could we actually control, the radiation, coming to the planet to slow these things down? It's just an engineering problem. It's a very high scale one, but it's actually completely achievable. I mean, with the technology that humankind has today, you could do these things. People who worry about slowing down greenhouse gases are not saying, well, if I couldn't slow them down, is there another engineering solution? I personally come from the camp that says, yes, you got a problem, we'll engineer a fix. And I think of that in very broad terms. So, I was just in Holland a week ago, and I was walking down the street with a Dutchman, and we were talking about some of these global warming things because it was very warm in Amsterdam that day. And he said, we were talking about global warming, much like your question said. And he pointed out, we were talking about how much the water level might rise. And he said, well, in Holland, we don't worry too much about that because we're already below sea level, and we've been that way for hundreds of years. And he says, we really have these dikes thing figured out. We really know how to make that work. And it may be that the Dutch will find an export business, for their dike technology, and they'll put it around Bangladesh or wherever they need it, to keep those places from getting flooded. And so, I think you have to be an optimist by nature to basically work in these fields. But I always think it's important to say, yes, it's fine to say we've gotten ourselves in a fix. Unfortunately, if you tend to look in the rearview mirror as a way to set policy, you say, oh, greenhouse gases created problem. Answer must be get rid of greenhouse gases. That sort of denies the idea that there may be other engineering fixes to counteract that. I don't know whether that'll be good or bad, but policymakers tend to not think about that way. And if there's a problem, cycles all the way back to the education comment, are we creating people who are prepared to think about alternative solutions, as opposed to just think about sort of trying to turn the clock back on the technologies that brought us to this point?
Mr. Mundie, number one, could you give us some examples of how Microsoft is using machine learning? And then with regards to cyber terrorism, it seems that we've got enough in place that it's surprising maybe we haven't had such an impact from this. And I'm wondering if we're good at thwarting it, number one. And secondly, what systems do you think are most vulnerable?
Machine learning, we use in lots and lots of ways in Microsoft. One of the I'll give you a new way. It came out like earlier this year. We have a system for the new email system, and it basically looks at how you process all your email, and it learns how you do it. And after a little while, you can basically say, okay, computer, you do what I would have done. All right. And so when you come in the morning, you look at your email, and it's organized it, and it said, well, you're going to delete these, all right? You're going to respond to these because they're the most important. These you're eventually going to want to do something about. And the dream is we can even get it to where it'll draft the responses you would have written. And then all you have to do is decide whether you trust it enough to let it do it automatically or you want to review what it wrote for you. But it turns out people in the vast majority of cases, if you give it enough data, like your email history and how you handled it, it can learn to emulate your behavior for the vast majority of your normal handling of your mail. Another one that's perhaps really important and for us been very exciting. One of the holy grails in computer science for a long time has been real-time language translation. And so we demonstrated, Rick Rashid, who ran research, he did it the first time almost exactly a year ago. And then I did it again in April of this year. Both times we did it in China because that was where we focused first. We have a system now that you can stand there like in an auditorium, give a speech, you put the headset on, and as you speak, the system listens to what you say, converts it into sort of subtitles, if you will, in English when I'm talking, picks words from which in Chinese you can make the same meaning, assembles those words into Chinese sentences, displays them as sentences, takes the sentence and synthesizes the spoken word in Chinese out of it, and passes it through a vocoder model of me so that it comes out in my own voice. And the latency on that is about 3/4 of a second. And the whole system depends on machine learning to become good enough to be usable. So we've tried doing this for more than 20 years and had largely always gotten to a word error rate that was about 20%. In other words, only 4 out of 5 words, would get translated. That is below the threshold of usability. Turns out the threshold for translation, really high quality human real-time translation, is in the error rate of about 7 to 8%. And so our goal was to say, could we get it so that it was about at the range of what a human interpreter who's trying to do this continuously in real time does. And the breakthrough came by using machine learning, the newest strategies, very high scale, very large data sets to train against. This idea wasn't new. In fact, people had tried this with neural networks 10, 20 more years ago. The problem was the data sets were small and the computers to do the learning were small. And as a result, we kind of got on the wrong path. And everybody tried to make, fancier neural networks and other things. They all plateaued. Then we came up with these super scale machines and a lot more data to feed it. And suddenly the thing was able to learn the rest of the way. And we're down into about the 7 or 8% error rate. And so that's very exciting for us. I mean, it's not a product yet, but the way to think about a dream we have for that is, take our Skype product. A lot of people use Skype. In fact, something like half of all the world's international voice communication minutes are now on Skype. And so almost by definition, a high percent of those people don't speak the same language, or they're each talking in English as a second language or something. In the future, the dream is that you fill out your Skype profile and you declare your preferred language. And you speak in your language, and it comes out in whoever you're talking to's preferred language in basically real time. And then they answer you in their language, and it comes out of your speaker in your language. And if you think of how profound that kind of thing would be, it's really important. So those are just 2 examples of things where machine learning's been making a real difference. Let's see, I forgot your other question. Thwarted the cyber terrorism. No, I think so far we've largely been lucky in that the cyber terror people are largely borrowing stuff from the criminal people. And the criminal people don't gain anything from destroying companies. So, so what's happened is now there's a variance in objectives between the terrorist guys and the criminal guys. In the past, they've basically been sort of sharing technology. What that meant was that the terrorist looked more like a mischievous actor with a denial of service attack. It wasn't destructive malware. The last year has been notable. We'll go down in the history books because it's the first time that these attacks have started to shift from essentially denial of service into destruction. Saudi Aramco, Razgas, the attacks in South Korea. These are basically destructive attacks waged by nation states against private businesses. And that is a very big shift. And so if you say, okay, as they get better at that, and they start to decide they want to do real damage. Right now in the United States, most of these attacks are against the banks in New York. All right? But they've still largely been the denial of service attacks. When those things shift to a destructive attack, you only have to find the weakest bank that's big. All right? And and the world's banking system has a problem. I mean, think of manufacturing a Lehman Brothers problem. All right, not because they went bankrupt, but because they couldn't operate anymore. And that's what these bad guys have figured out is an interesting thing to go after. I think, and frankly, I think that the havoc that gets created by taking out those things may, in fact, be greater than trying to go out and take out, a power grid or, a substation or something else. Anything with a SCADA system in it is likely to be at risk these days because much like the PCs of a decade ago, when we used to write the software a decade ago, we never wrote them thinking about all these things being connected to the network at a global scale. I mean, it just wasn't part of the design spec. So today it is. Unfortunately, most of the world's infrastructure are running on microprocessor-based controllers that never gave a lick of a thought about, we might connect these things. And so I think there's a lot of problems lurking in all kinds of critical infrastructure. And I would say between the banks and some of those things, they're the things that would be the targets that the bad guys would go after.
I have a worry about the future of scholarly knowledge, and I'm hoping you'll reassure me. And
Probably not.
Don't worry anymore. Since the
That might be your worst nightmare.
Well, that's the other half. But since the Enlightenment, we have produced scholarly knowledge, public scholarly knowledge, simultaneously with showing the way in which we produced it, which is to say, here's the experiment we ran, and this is the finding. I'm a sociologist. Here's my questionnaire. Here's the sampling design. Here's my finding. And we use that total transparency about the production of the knowledge for replication. And it's replication that allows us to find error, fraud, and be self-correcting. Insofar as the Academy is going to be dipping into big data, almost all, not all, but a large proportion of which is produced by private companies, the algorithms which produce the pieces of knowledge are not going to be shared with us, which means we have a huge replication problem. We have to trust what we get from Google, the social media, search engines, and so forth, without seeing the process by which it gets produced. Should I worry or not?
Well, while you're thinking of that answer to that, perhaps in the interest of time, we should collect a couple of questions. Would that be all right?
Sure. Thanks very much for being here today. My question goes back to something you actually mentioned just a couple minutes ago, which is the physical infrastructure and what needs to change there in order to enable, I guess, less problems with cybersecurity and greater developments and more innovation and just general connectivity.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you got away from the mic there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The last part?
I was just hoping you could speak to the infrastructural developments that need to happen. The physical infrastructure developments with technology. Yeah.
Something I'm very curious about regards the intersection between technology and labor economics. We've seen a lot of disruption in employment due to automation over especially over the last 20 years, particularly for people who do repetitive tasks. And I know there are people in the software industry and in the robotics industry who think that within some indeterminate period of time, maybe 50 years, that machines will be able to do most things better than people. Now, some people argue like this is just the lump of labor fallacy all over again. We saw this with the mechanization of farming. Eventually the labor markets will adjust and will go on. There are other people who argue that no, this time is really different. That because computers and robots have the potential to be so versatile and so adaptable, that we may actually be looking at a fundamental change in the structure of our economy. And I don't see policymakers really talking about this, and I was wondering whether you think this is something to worry about or whether this concern is misguided or overblown.
Okay. Should you worry? I contend that even in the classical terms, that a scientist always sort of stands on the shoulders of those that have gone before. Not everything. I mean, if you put an instrument in your lab, did you know absolutely everything about the instrument? Nope, probably not. Was that cause for worry? No, because there was an established record, that said, well, I bought this Tektronix, signal generator, and they seem to make signals all the time. That didn't mean that one of them couldn't break and you might have messed up your experiment, but by and large, it wasn't a problem. So I think that insofar as some of these large established, I'll call them data products, they're just the new instruments, and to the extent that they are an established capability and everybody's using it the same way, then I don't think you'd have to worry about any more than you have to worry about other things. Now, if it turns out that your research is somehow sensitive to how that thing delivers its result, that then you can at least ask the question. But there, I think what academia has to do is realize, well, if that's a real problem, then it's going to have to figure out one of two things: how academia can be trusted by business, all right? Or it's going to have to invest to be able to do what business does itself. And the problem we got right now in academia is they can't do either one of those things, because their penchant for, quote, transparency is that, in my view, has actually been used as an excuse for their, I'm trying to find a nice word, inability to keep their promises about not disclosing things. So if a company goes and say, hey, I'll give you some data for this use and this use alone, all right, if it's important to your research, but you can't give it to anybody else. Many times now academia has taken that data, made that promise, done their research, and then violated the promise. So businesses say, whoop, we've had enough of that. Thank you very much. So our data is our data. It's not for academia. And so I think that academia is going to have to get more disciplined about saying, look, if it's really essential to know, then, you may have to be bound to certain constraints in order to satisfy yourself. And maybe someone who's going to try to prove your experiment could be agreed in advance that, you have to be able to replicate the result. But right now, the discipline isn't really there. the flip side is equally a problem in that the facilities necessary to do the largest scale machine learning and other things are not available in academia, and I don't think they will be. And so unless we get into, you could say it's the new supercomputing problem. But, so you can either buy it from Microsoft, Amazon, or whoever, at some scale you can't provision yourself. That's better than trying to do it yourself, I think. Or, academia's going to have to decide, how it's going to, through consortia or government funding or whatever it is, build the superscale facilities to actually be on the leading edge of this research as opposed to the trailing edge of this research. And this is a thing that is, I'm going to think, a fundamental problem. In the past, if you think about this in the flops world, the mega flops world, people say, well, hey, the difference between having a really big computer and a not so big computer in the flop world was, well, maybe my grid won't be as big, or, but I'm just trying to learn how to do it. I don't really have to make the airplane. I just have to figure out how the algorithm works. And then Boeing has to have a really big computer. In the big data world, it doesn't work that way, in my experience. That, the thing that makes big data work is the big. And so if you don't actually have big, you don't have anything. And so I think there's going to be this really interesting question about scalability. And I think it's going to be a crisis in academia when everything is data-driven, including education, and you don't have the facilities to do the big data stuff yourself in a really good way. So I think that's going to be a problem. As to the infrastructure, there's two questions. What can you do to improve that which we have? And I think you have to answer that question first, because there's no way to wave your wand and rebuild any society's infrastructure overnight. And so I think a lot of work is going to have to be done in the command and control infrastructure for critical infrastructure facilities in order to harden them, or at least sequester them in ways that make it a bit more possible to defend. In broad terms, though, I think that the whole model of defense has to go from this medieval defensive one to what we call active defense, where there's just going to have to be a lot more sophistication where government, law enforcement, and critical infrastructure operators have to come together in some real-time way to detect and to terminate attacks. This is sort of the question of, do you arm your policemen or even have policemen? Today, in cyberspace, we largely almost don't have policemen, and those that we have, we don't arm. And the bad guys all have guns. And so, the society is now going to have to step up to that question, in my view, on the infrastructure side. And so to the extent you get it right, then I think any new infrastructure should be built anticipating those requirements. But we're going to have to do both at the same time. And then to the labor displacement question, in some ways I do think it may be different this time. But then I also tend to think in some ways it won't be different. And it comes back to the way I answered the question about the environmental factors. If you do this forecast and the only thing you know about work is the kind of work we currently do, then you should worry. If, on the other hand, you say that the work we currently do may be taken over by machines, but if we invent wholly new classes of technology, and those things can't readily be done by machines, then what do the people need to know how to do, that the machines can't do? A year or so ago, I wrote a paper that argued that what a country like the United States would need in the future is to be a nation of technicians. And that the thing that will distinguish the successful workforce of the future is that virtually everyone is trained in some way as a technician. And I chose that word as something that's like more than what we've classically thought about as what you learn in trade schools or the trades or other things, but not, what you get taught, if you're a professional engineer as your employment. And in the past, that sort of the thing that lay in the middle was classical manufacturing jobs. And I think that those are going to go away. So the question is there a new kind of manufacturing that will emerge based on technologies we don't currently have, for which people, if they were trained appropriately, would find employment? And I'm hopeful about that. And the work that I have been doing with people on the policy side is trying to anticipate that. But that maybe segues, to this last question of, with or education. The education system, certainly in this country, but everywhere, is completely not prepared, to basically produce a distribution of capability in the population at large that meets these needs. And, that's the thing I actually worry about the most. Because I think that the inventive types are likely, the amount of innovation that is happening in the world is stunning. And so on one hand, if you're part of that thing, you just keep saying to yourself, wow, there's just going to be an unlimited number of new things. And then you go out and you say, oh, I need to hire some people. And you go look around and you say, where are they? In the United States today, with the world's best education system, I think Microsoft in the United States, Microsoft just by ourselves, we have 6,000 engineering jobs we can't fill in the United States, and more outside the United States. But we're just trying to get the ones for which the system is supposedly good. This whole big block, the bulk of the population that's in the middle, man, academia's doing nothing for them. And as far as I can tell, has no plan. And I predict that the United States and every economy will live or die on this labor economics question, employment question about whether they're actually prepared to transform their education system, to create a population of people who can work in an environment where every job requires some kind of technical literacy. And right now, we are not on that path.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conversation, a great landscape covered. You've been very generous with your time and your candor. Please join me in thanking Craig Mundie.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great.